flight experience. Someone else had experience, however, the Soviet Union, and that made all the difference. It was the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, and any Russian technological advance was dangerous to U.S. security and pride. It became a race. The starting gun had sounded on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviets launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik 1. 1 month later, Russia put a living being in orbit, a female dog named Laika. She was dubbed Mutnik by the media, but most Americans weren't laughing. Intercontinental ballistic missiles that launched satellites and animals could also carry nuclear weapons. The final blow to American confidence came on April 12, 1961, when 27-year-old Yuri Gagarin circled the Earth once. The flight took less than 2 hours. The United States hastened to catch up. A series of disastrous rocket tests preceded it, but America moved into second place with the launch of astronaut Alan Shepard on a brief suborbital flight. Shepard was part of Project Mercury, a calculated gamble to push ahead of the Russians. 7 military test pilots had been selected by the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. On the third manned flight, America succeeded in placing John Glenn in orbit. 3 more missions were flown, and the U.S. accumulated slightly more than 2 days in space. Project Gemini, a series of 2-manned flights named for the Latin word for twins, was the next manned program. Gemini served as a link between Mercury and Apollo and featured astronauts common to both. During Gemini 4, Ed White engaged in the first American EVA, extravehicular activity, or spacewalk as it became known. The Russians were only slightly ahead of us now. They had done the same thing 2.5 months earlier. U.S. momentum continued. Throughout 1965 and 1966, the 10 Gemini missions closed the gap, and America began to achieve their own firsts. Among them were the first true space rendezvous, and during Gemini 8, the first docking of 2 space vehicles. Gemini 8 almost ended in disaster, however. The linked spacecraft began spinning. Separating from the target vehicle made the problem worse. On the verge of blacking out, the crew got the ship under control. At the controls were 2 future Apollo astronauts, David Scott, and as commander, 35-year-old Neil Alden Armstrong. It had been America's closest call so far. Meanwhile, scientists worked on a rocket to replace the Titan boosters of Gemini for the moon trips. The answer was the Saturn, most powerful machine ever built by humans. It stood taller than the Statue of Liberty and would launch the 35-foot-long Apollo capsule to its destination. The Saturn's ignition blast was brighter than the sun and would propel man faster than he had ever traveled before. The Saturn rocket was 100 times more powerful than the Redstone rocket that launched Shepard to the edge of space. "12 men would eventually walk the surface of the moon. The crew selection process had begun as early as 1962. Finally, these missions were scheduled to begin. The man in charge of the astronauts was Deke Slayton, director of flight crew operations. Slayton was one of the original 7 astronauts of Mercury, but had never flown. Several weeks before his launch, doctors discovered an intermittent, irregular heartbeat and grounded him. Ironically, he would now decide the lineup of each Apollo mission. During the summer of 1994, 15 of these men gathered as guests of honor at the Experimental Aircraft Association's annual fly-in convention in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. They talked frankly about the risks and joys of the program. It was a time of celebration, the 25th anniversary of the first moonwalk.
The enormity of that task.
Unfortunately, the risks had become apparent right from the start. The first step to the moon had been a horribly painful lesson. During a routine ground test of Apollo 204, or Apollo 1 as it was later designated, astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, the second American in space, Ed White, and rookie Roger Chaffee were killed when a flash fire destroyed their capsule.
Well, on January the 27th in '67, we lost 3 good friends and astronauts in a fire. The first real tragedy that had occurred in the space program. NASA at that time was a gung-ho outfit. We had not had serious setbacks, and it stunned the organization because we had allowed a lot of hydrocarbons to creep into an environment that was 100% oxygen.
A 14-volume report released after the accident speculated that a malfunction in the electrical system was the cause of the fire. In the pressurized, oxygen-saturated cabin, a spark spelled disaster.
We knew we had trouble with that spacecraft. It was the first one, but no one expected this, particularly in a test on the pad. But I am always amazed at how the organization got its act together, and it was a remarkable turnaround. I was part of the investigative authority. It was also, I think, one of the most candid reports to Congress ever made. We just got up there and said, look, we made a mistake, a big mistake, and it cost 3 lives. But we think we understand it now, and we want to go forward, and it worked out that way. It was a fact of life that was a dangerous business, and 3 people got killed, and that we went on from there.
20 months later, after several unmanned test launches, Apollo 7 was ready. The command capsule had been completely redesigned. The mission, extensive Earth orbit evaluation of the command service module, was crucial to American confidence. The commander was Wally Schirra. Don Isley was the command module pilot, and although no lunar module was attached, Walter Cunningham's official designation was Lunar Module Pilot. A veteran of both Mercury and Gemini, Wally Schirra was the only astronaut to fly all 3 programs.
5, 4, ignition, GRR.
In the Apollo program, Walt and Don Isley and I had to pick up after losing the 3 men on the launch pad, and it was a tough one. We had to make the spacecraft work. I had announced before the flight, not many people remember that I was leaving the space program because I had no other flight scheduled I could see in the future.
The object of Apollo 7 was to perform all of the checkout of all the spacecraft systems and fly a mission that hopefully would be of a duration as long as the longest then planned lunar landing, which was 11 days. And I have to tell you that the spacecraft was fantastic. We had